latest COVID-19 inquiries hearing suite. May we have your attention for some brief housekeeping announcements. Waverley Gates has a fire alarm test every Tuesday at 10 AM. If the alarm sounds at any other time, please make your way out the fire exit at the back left corner of the hearing room and down the staircase to your right, which will exit onto Colton Road, the muster point for the inquiry. Please follow these instructions unless advised otherwise by a fire marshal, and if in doubt, follow the green emergency exit signs. Do take a moment to familiarise yourself with our hearing suite etiquette. This can be found on the hearing suite TV screens now. There is a cafe on the ground floor selling hot drinks and snacks, but we kindly request that you only consume water in the hearing suite. You can help yourself to water in glasses, which you can find in the kitchen next to our reception desk. Inquiry staff are wearing orange lanyards. Please approach them if you require assistance. Please ensure that your phones, laptops and any electronic devices are on silent mode. Device screens may be captured on the broadcast during wide shots of the hearing suite. All attendees are kindly asked to stand when the inquiry chair enters and leaves the hearing room. A member of the inquiry team will inform you when to stand. Please remain at your seats until the chair and witnesses have left the room. Thank you for your attention. The hearing will start in a few moments.
Good morning, Mr. Stephen.
Good morning, my Lord. My Lord, the first witness giving evidence today is Fiona Arnott-Barron of Cruse, Scotland.
Good morning. Yes, Mr. Stephen, when you're ready.
Thank you, my Lord. Good morning.
Morning.
Could I ask, please, by starting you to confirm your full name? Thank you.
Sure, it's Fiona Arnott-Barron.
Thank you. And you've already provided a written statement to the inquiry, and for the record, the inquiry reference number for that statement is SCI-WT 0790-50 Just to reiterate at the outset that everything you said in that written statement will be taken into account by the inquiry, even if we don't touch on every single aspect of it in your oral evidence today. And just a gentle reminder that there are stenographers in the room for the purposes of the transcript, so please do try and speak slowly and clearly.
Okay.
Thank you. Now, you're here today to provide evidence on behalf of Cruse Scotland, is that right?
That's correct.
And your current role there is as Chief Executive Officer?
That's correct, yeah.
And how long have you held that role for?
Almost 3 years now.
Thank you. And during the pandemic, you held a different role, is that correct?
That's correct. I was the Chief Operating Officer, and that meant I looked after all the service, the delivery side of things.
Thank you. And overall, I think you say in your statement that you've been employed by Cruse for over 23 years?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, Cruse Scotland provides bereavement support services across Scotland.
That's right, yes.
And do you have offices in various locations across Scotland?
We do. So we have offices in 4 locations that belong to the charity. That's in Aberdeen, in Perth, Edinburgh and Glasgow. But we offer services across Scotland, so where we don't have premises, we make use of rooms in local GP surgeries, community settings, wherever we can beg, borrow or steal them.
And for how long has Cruse been in existence offering these bereavement support services?
So we were part of Cruse UK, and that's been since 1959, but Cruse Scotland became a charity in its own right in April of 2001.
And does Cruse have an overarching aim or vision for what it does?
It's to relieve the suffering brought about by grief and bereavement.
Thank you. And you mentioned Cruse as a charity. Can I ask you how Cruse is ordinarily funded?
It's a bit of a mix. So we receive some Scottish Government funding, and the key parts of that are from mental health and wellbeing, from children and families, and from suicide prevention. We receive some council funding. I have to say that has reduced quite a lot in recent times, but we also we receive funding from different charitable trusts, and of course do some of our own sort of events and challenge fundraising as well.
Thank you. And in terms of the makeup of your organisation, I think you say in your statement that client services are delivered by local volunteers. Is that right?
Yeah. So there's a small staff team that covers Scotland. At the moment there's 21 of us. In whole-time equivalents that actually means 15 and a half. But the client services are all delivered by volunteers, so helpline, children and young people's, counselling support, all volunteers, and there are about 250 of them.
And how many staff do you have during the pandemic?
During the pandemic, I'm pretty sure, I'll just double check my notes, I knew these would come in handy. We were around, 13 members of staff during the pandemic. Thank you.
And in terms of those volunteers, would they receive training from Cruse before undertaking their roles?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So the training is different depending on the role. So as you'd imagine, those that are supporting children and young people, their training is specific to that group. But even within the counselling and listening team, we have listening volunteers who would look after more straightforward bereavements, whereas we have actual counsellors who hold a diploma in counselling that would meet with clients with greater needs and possibly with other challenges in the mix.
Thank you. Which brings me on to then, I think, the range of services which Cruse provides. Could you give an outline of the bereavement support services which you offer and the methods by which you do so?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a helpline which is open each day of the week, and that is used where people can refer in for services, but it can just be for a bit of a chat, a bit of reassurance. People can also use it in between sessions if they're struggling. Even clients who've left the service, it might be coming up to an anniversary or something, so they can use it in that way. We also have what we call instant support, so that's web-based. It's not automated responses, it's actually a live counsellor that's on the end, and that's a chat function, and that can be anything from finding out a bit of information to actual full engagement, and that's another way to refer in. Email can be used as well, because not everyone wants to speak and say the words out loud. Those are the kind of ways into the service, but in terms of the service themselves, excuse me, I'm going to just have a little drink.
No problem.
For adults, we meet with anyone at any point in their bereavement, but what service we offer depends on when they've been bereaved. So what we call early support is for adults who've been bereaved within the first 6 months. And the options for support would be either individual, and that can be in person, online, by phone, or we have groups that would meet for up to 6 sessions. For those that refer in after 6 months bereaved, they would more go into our counselling model, and that is initially contracting for up to 6 sessions, and if needed, some more. We have groups that run. It's fair to say they tend to be in areas where there's a greater population, so we run a lot in Glasgow, but Edinburgh and Aberdeen too. We also have some social support groups, so there's Walk and Talk at the moment in Fife and Dundee. But there's also some more specialised services, so we can support clients with learning disabilities, people whose maybe first language isn't English, or with refugee or asylum status. We make use of an interpreter. I think that covers it for adults. Do you want me to say about children?
No, that's fine. And we'll come back to some of those groups in due course. So
Sorry.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think you also say in your statement that you also provide training and education in terms of dealing with grief. Is that right?
We do. So obviously we offer the training to the volunteers who are coming in, but we also offer our training on a paid basis to workplaces and organisations who wish to improve their team's understanding of grief, bereavement, and yeah, that's a real mixture. To schools and things as well. And we received funding recently where we could offer some community-based training just for members of the public and things. It's part of our mission just to make grief better understood in society.
Thank you. And you touched on this, I think, in your earlier answer, but in terms of who's eligible to benefit from your services, I think you say in your statement that's not restricted just to family members, for example. Is that right?
That's correct. So it's anyone really, family, but friends and colleagues. But sometimes people are impacted by a bereavement as a member of the public, particularly if there's been a road traffic accident or a suicide or something like that. So there's no limit.
And in terms of the window of time, it could be from the day after death to sometime later.
Decades after sometimes, yeah.
Thank you. And I think you mentioned you work with both adults and children.
Yes.
How would you say the services differ in respect of adults and children in terms of the support you offer? So for children, how would you support them? How would that change? So
we're really working with the GIRFEC principles, getting it right for every child. So it has to look different depending on that child's age and stage and the supports that are around them as well. It depends greatly who's referred them in as well, because sometimes if it's the school who's referred them in, that gives an indication of there might not be the same supports at home and things. So and that it's not in a time limited way as well. But how you would support an 8-year-old is very different to how you would support a teenager. So yeah, it's a great gamut of ways. We use things like play therapy and whereas an older teenager it may look a wee bit more like the adult service. Thank you. And in terms of your service users, do they tend to have a particular background or faith? Is that something that you're aware of? We we're not a faith-based organisation, and it's something that, you know, as part of the counselling training, that's not something that we do. Obviously, if people come with a faith and wish to talk about that, absolutely. But I would say clients who do disclose their faith tend to be people with no faith or of Christian faith.
Thank you. And pre-COVID, how were your services delivered? What would be the primary method of doing that?
Yeah, in the main, face-to-face support, and there wasn't online at that point. The other option was phone support, and that was really just if somebody lived in a very remote place or had very limited availability. So yeah, that was a rarity.
And again, prior to COVID, do you know how roughly the number of referrals you'd be receiving in a year from people who needed your help?
So yeah, I did reference this in the statement, so that I'm not giving any duff information. So in the year leading up to the pandemic, that was the year sort of 1920. Not 1920.
Yes.
It's 2019.
I do that all the time.
You're with me. You're with me. So yeah, in 2019 to 2020, there was 4,261 referrals.
Thank you. And would you have had a waiting list at that time?
Yes, we did.
And how long, roughly, do you know, would that have been?
It's a very hard question because we have the different services, they have different waiting times. Yeah, I would say maybe 3-4 months for counselling. Early support, there tends to be little waiting time, but yeah, that would be an approximate.
Thank you. We move then to the pandemic, and I want to talk, I think, first instance about the impact on your organisation. We'll come to the bereaved and others later. And as you note in your statement, I think at paragraph 19, face-to-face services had to be suspended.
Yes.
Could I then start by asking you the changes that you had to make to your service delivery and how quickly you were able to get those up and running when lockdown, for example, started?
Yeah, so like every place else, you know, we were told that we would need to close the doors. There would be no face-to-face support. So yeah, we were very quickly had to sort of put all those wheels in motion. Now, it's fair to say that volunteers before then were offered the opportunity to engage in offering telephone support, but were not keen at all. But for those volunteers who were midway through working with a client, I've had, you know, maybe a few face-to-face sessions, to then have to pause that is not a good thing at all. You've opened that lid on their feelings and things. So there was a real kind of, I must do something here. So we said, well, you know, we do have all the phones set up there if you would like to make use of that. So they were kind of saying, well, yeah, let's do this kind of thing. So we were able to make that happen. Within 5 days, we had those appointments kind of all connected. I think that gave the volunteers the confidence to, oh, actually, this does work. It's maybe not what we're used to. It might not be as good as, and I would say that was the feeling at the outset, but it's better than nothing. And so we then had volunteers, many of whom were on furlough and things like that with all this extra time, and we were sitting with a waiting list, and it just seemed the sensible thing to bring the two together. I have to say, the surprise from people who weren't already started their support to then receive this call from Cruse Scotland, where they'd referred in maybe a couple of months before the pandemic, to then say, we're in a position to offer you an appointment now. They were absolutely blown away by it because everything had just seemed to stop. So that was a great thing to be able to do, because a lot of people who'd been bereaved just before the pandemic, their things were all just put aside, you know. Everyone's attentions had turned to all that was going on, which, you know, was understandable, but for them sitting with all their thoughts. So that was a great position to be in. We very quickly got some training in place, because working with people when you can't see them, and if that's how you're used to working, is quite different. You're not observing the body language, all the little cues that you're used to. So BACP, who are the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, they moved very quickly, and they had all these amazing free resources that we could tap into. And of course, people had the time to attend extra training and things, so we put all that into place. Things that weren't really a thing for us before, the disinhibition effect. It's people will often disclose a bit more when they can't see who they're talking with as well. So yeah, that was all new learning, but something that we adapted well to.
And you talked, I think, about that reticence or volunteers perhaps wondering whether telephone support would be effective. Was that an attitude that changed over time when you were running these appointments?
Absolutely, and it's not just anecdotal evidence either. I mean, as I say, I think for the clients, we're just so surprised and to have that opportunity. But we do evaluation for all our client services, and we ask, you know, how the service was and the impact it had, and the evaluations were as strong for phone support and latterly for in-person as they were online as they were for in-person. So that gave them the confidence that they were making the difference, because they take their roles very seriously, they're very proud, and obviously want to know that they're making a difference. So.
And you spoke earlier about the use of local volunteers. Mm-hmm. When the restrictions were imposed, did the allocation or pairing up process with appointments, did that have to change as a result of restrictions on movement, for example?
Yes. I would say that was quite a challenge initially, because if you referred in from Aberdeen, say, that would have just been the local office there who dealt with you, and then you would have been allocated to an Aberdeen volunteer. During the pandemic, of course, where we had the volunteers maybe didn't match up with where the clients were. But because it was by phone, that didn't actually matter. So we were able to, I would say be more efficient, really, because we could use the resource where it was needed most. That's been good.
Thank you. You do mention in your statement at paragraph 41 about the bereaved perhaps feeling a loss of community when face-to-face services were suspended. What do you mean by that?
Certainly where we had the groups, so we had, they were called step-by-step groups. It tended to be more elderly people, and the whole idea of the groups was for people who were socially isolated because of their bereavement. They were often people who'd been in a caring role, so had kind of lost contact with sort of friends and things. So this was to build up their confidence, get them out and about again. So that, for them, that was a huge, a downfall in the pandemic, because you weren't allowed to connect with people that weren't in your bubble.
And you mentioned the elderly as one group as an example there. Were they a group, and were there other groups who perhaps weren't able to access your services, whether it was due to access to digital technology, for example, if you're having online counselling appointments? Was that an issue?
Yes, definitely. I mean, yes, it limited things, and not everyone wants a service by phone as well. When we think of counselling, we do tend to think of face-to-face, but I think the bereaved as a community were more isolated. They just couldn't see friends and even colleagues and things in the same way that they would have before. So, yeah, that was a huge impact.
And sticking with the elderly for a moment, I think you talk at paragraph 46 of your statement about having to become creative in your approach if they were unable to access the technology. What were you able to do in terms of support?
So those step-by-step groups, I think, were probably the biggest challenge, and I would say one of the groups that we identified as, being most at risk, because they were so isolated. So technology was a huge barrier. I mean, most of them didn't have the technology, but I think those that did maybe struggled a bit to use it. So we came up with the idea, I'm going to take full credit for this one because it was my idea, of an old-fashioned conference call. Now, probably most people here are a bit too young to remember these, but way back in the day, everyone would have the same number that we would all dial at the same time, and you would have a little PIN code, and you just pop that in, and then it meant everyone was on the same call at the same time. So all the group members were able to speak with each other. But in addition to that, those that just didn't have any friends or family, we arranged individual calls for them in addition to that. So that was a really creative way. We hadn't done conference calls for years, but yet, it was a way of making that happen, and they were just so grateful for it because all their, the other services that they connected with had paused. So, yeah, it was the only thing for some.
Thank you. And for some of those bereaved that were coming to you for support, was gaining access to a private space to discuss, obviously, what might be quite difficult things to discuss, was that an issue?
Yeah, I mean, as we know, a lot of people, they created bubbles, so that meant that more people could be living in a house together. To sort of have a counselling session when you've got the fear of being overheard is very off-putting, understandably. So having that private space, it was huge. It was amazing how creative people came about it. We had clients having a session from the shed. One person had a caravan in their driveway and had their session from there in the car. So, the clients became as creative as we did because the opportunity existed.
Thank you. Moving on then to, I suppose, any impact on your staff who were at the other end of this, I suppose, listening to what might be quite difficult things to listen to. Were there any issues that they fed back to you about having to work from home and deal with that subject matter?
It's fair to say that it would more be the volunteers who listen to some of those difficult things because the staff it's more the staff do the administration side of things. For the volunteers, there was no pressure on them. It's not like working with staff, so we were very relaxed. It was if people wanted to continue their role during that time. We had to be careful that folk weren't given a bit too much time. Because listening to all these difficult stories, it can be difficult. But some of them faced the same challenges with getting the private space as well. And of course, we need it to be a private space that they're taking calls and things from. Again, they became creative too. One of our early clients, one of our volunteers early on in the pandemic, who was mid-support, had a young baby at home and a toddler, and of course she just didn't want to risk any of them crying or anything during the session, so she delivered it from the car. So that's how we get over some of these things.
Thank you. In terms of the number of referrals that your organisation was receiving when these restrictions were imposed, did that fluctuate at all?
Yes, we were really surprised. As soon as lockdown hit, it was almost like somebody had switched our helpline off. Between April of 2020 and June, I mean, we had so few referrals coming in. It was like nothing we'd seen before. So much so that we were really having to put things out on social media and get in touch with the GP surgeries to say, we're here, we are here. Every cloud has a silver lining. That allowed us to connect with people who had referred in before, and the waiting list reduced to not. I mean, people were phoning one day and we were able to allocate an appointment a couple of days later. That has never happened before in the organisation. But things did slowly pick up again in the July. And
what do you attribute that initial drop to? I mean, I think in your statement you talk about it plummeting, I think, at the beginning is what absolutely. You said. I mean, why do you think that was?
My sense was it was an assumption that because so many places had had to pause their services, that people just assumed we weren't available.
Yeah, thank you. And in terms of the nature of the referrals you were receiving prior to COVID, what would have been the most common causes of death for which people were coming to you to seek support?
So throughout my time in the organisation, the most common reason that people seek our support is from cancer. And then it's heart attack or heart disease is the second, and the third is suicide. And that, you know, has always, that was pre-pandemic, that's where we are again just now, but it changed during the pandemic.
And how did it change?
So it was deaths by COVID became the third most common reason that folk sought our services, which was, that was quite alarming.
And in respect of those COVID deaths, you say at paragraph 44 of your statement that people were coming to you with issues out with what could rationally be perceived as healthy grief. That's the way you put it in the statement. Could you explain what you mean by that, please?
So there's a couple of factors. I would say the complexity of people's grief was something that we had never seen before. So I talked earlier about those different levels of volunteers that we allocate to, and if you think of it like a triangle, most of the referrals would sort of rate at that more bottom level, just people needing a listening ear and to, you know, just be heard and talk things through. And at the top of the triangle would be people that need counselling support, and, you know, the sense that we think about that. It was like somebody turned that triangle on its head. The level of need, we do assessments, the people's scores were so high, just high levels of distress. It's just hard to put it into words. A lot of anger in there, most definitely, but guilt just. And I think we will come on to that, but that was a huge shift. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your question, because there was two parts to my answer.
No, I was just asking about perhaps how the grieving had changed, or things that were out with what you had normally seen before as grief. You mentioned anger there. Can I ask you just to explain anger at what? Anything in particular?
There was a huge anger at people not being able to have people at the funerals that they wanted, or not being able to be with the person who was dying. It's fair to say that there was a lot of anger when things came out in the media about politicians and things that hadn't adhered to the restrictions that we were asked to do. So, yeah, a lot of resentment about people that had stuck to the rules and did as they were told, despite this, horrific situation going on, and then others that people sort of feel should stick to the rules weren't. So, yeah, a lot of anger around there. The other part about the difference in sort of people's their grieving, we reckon the reason this happened was we got a lot of people that were coming to us maybe with alcohol in the mix, or with maybe with drug misuse and things. And it was almost like it was just they were getting a response, and maybe there was a bereavement in the mix, but it wasn't really the main feature, if you like. Now, normally, when we do assessments and we can see that maybe it is maybe alcohol that's the most pressing issue, and that's not to say once that's been supported that then we can help with bereavement. But the difficulty was that there wasn't often places where you could signpost to, and a lot of our counsellors that are fully trained counsellors, that left them with a real challenge, because actually this was clients that they could support and work with, and yet as an organisation we were saying, look guys, our role is bereavement. We're insured to deliver bereavement support, but that's really hard when somebody's needing support. There's no place to take them to, and you can do it. So, yeah, that was a difficult one.
So, in the absence, perhaps, of other support services, people were coming to you, and it perhaps
yes.
Thank
you. And I've used sort of drugs and alcohol, but it was lots of different things. Domestic abuse was in there as well. So just, it was almost people just sussing out where they could get a response and going with that.
Thank you. You mentioned funerals. I'd like to come to that. And the inquiry has heard evidence about funerals and will continue to do so this week. One factor I think you mentioned in your statement is that of the delay of funerals.
Yeah.
Can I ask firstly how that affected the bereaved that you were supporting?
Yeah, so the delays was a huge factor. People often build themselves up to just getting the funeral out of the way. But actually then there was a longer time in between that. Again, there was things, that funeral directors could only have the body in, a shape suitable for viewing and things for a certain length of time. And, for some people, they want to go and visit the body until the cremation or burial. So there's all these different things. We all have our own ideas about rituals and how things should be done. Sometimes it might be because they know it's the wishes of the person. A lot of those things were removed, and that's where so many of these complexities around that. So the funerals was part of that. I know that there was quite an issue around procurator fiscals at that time, and, you know, bodies being moved from one location over to another. I mean, these are kind of more unusual examples, but they did feature in some of the clients that came forward.
Thank you. But in terms of the restrictions on the conduct of funerals themselves, when those could take place, were there any particular restrictions that were being raised with you in bereavement support?
The number that could attend a funeral was quite a complex thing. You know, where there's bigger families, you know, kind of deciding who could go and who couldn't go, that caused quite a bit of fallout, as you could imagine. But all those things, you know, some people want to have a wake afterwards, you know, that's what the person might have wanted or expected. But families just not feeling they could fulfil what they felt was the right thing was really, really, really difficult. I mean, you know, not even being able to go for the cup of tea afterwards and things, really, really challenging. And of course, we know for some groups, you know, they want to have they do the washing of the bodies and things like that, and all these things at the start of the pandemic were just not available. So, yeah, that was a difficult one.
Yes, I mean, at paragraph 60, I think, of your statement, you say people felt as though they let the deceased down and carried guilt about not giving them an appropriate send-off. Is that an issue which you still see in terms of the support that you offer now, post-pandemic?
Absolutely. It's... Yeah, the people just feel they never got that opportunity to give the send-off. You know, initially when we were all thrust into the pandemic, there was that sense that, well, we can't do this, you know, celebration of life or whatever just now, but we'll do it as soon as we can. And then, of course, that didn't come. You know, we were then in a second lockdown, or, you know, even after the second lockdown, it's after the passage of time that, yeah, things change for people. So, yeah, that was pretty significant. What I would say is there's still a lot of feelings around that. The guilt is just huge. The feeling of failure that they let their loved one down. And actually, we've seen quite a few more referrals from friends afterwards as well, who were not included within, you know, the numbers, particularly visiting at the end of life, but also then in the funerals. And, you know, nowadays, people often are a bit closer to friends than family. So, yeah, they were really kind of pushed aside. But where we are now is many people have actually had a bereavement since a bereavement in the pandemic. And so there's that comparing and contrasting. You know, we were able to give, you know, this person the send-off that they would have liked and things, but actually we let so-and-so down. So it's something that just keeps recurring.
Thank you. We've touched on, I think, the impact on bereaved adults. I'd like to come now to children. And as you said at the outset of your evidence, that's another group that obviously you support. And you do say in your statement, I think at paragraph 49, that services for children and young people were hugely affected during the pandemic. Can I ask you how the suspension of face-to-face services, which you said was predominant pre-pandemic, how did that affect those children and young people in dealing with you for support? So, if we split them into two groups, so there's children kind of primary school age, under 12 if you like. There is guidance that actually you shouldn't have a professional shouldn't have an online a call
with a child under the age of 12 without a supporting adult being present. That, it's just like putting the barriers up. You know, once you build up a relationship with a child and young person, most of the time the biggest fear that they have is that other adults around about them will die. They won't say that when the person's next to them. Of course they won't. So what we know is often the thing that they need to talk about and are sitting with and struggling with. We just couldn't get to it. And that's hard to say to the supporting adult that's there. Actually, you know, they're worried about you. So that was really difficult. And what came as a huge surprise to us is our assumption at the start was sort of more secondary age who could have that sort of one-to-one call. You know, they're a group that are probably more tech savvy than the rest of us. They just didn't want to engage. I think that their life had just become tech. Their schooling was online, you know, contact with friends was online. The last thing they wanted to do was to be online, and you know, they kept saying, could we not meet in person and things. So it was one of the first things as soon as we could was to prioritise getting children and young people meeting in person.
Thank you. If we move on then to the lifting of restrictions, I suppose any longer term effects since the pandemic. I mean, I think you say again in your statement at paragraph 74 that the complexity of client need, which I think you've touched on to an extent, since the pandemic has been phenomenal. Can I ask you just to elaborate on A, what that complexity is, and B, how that's impacted upon how your organisation now operates?
Sure. So I think it's fair to say that mental health across the pandemic, for most people, it was like somebody turned the volume up. So you've got that, just people just generally more anxious, more stressed, and then a bereavement into that mix. Yeah, people are going to struggle a bit more. But just some of the things that I've talked about, you know, that huge guilt, that feeling of failure, the anger and resentment, they're all huge factors to unpick. Just that feeling of people just having no control and letting loved ones down, is the most significant factor, I would say. Yeah.
And in terms of, I suppose, your organisation's resources and the demands on your volunteers and staff, but volunteers who are obviously listening to these things, has that changed also since the pandemic? Yeah,
I mean, for them, you know, almost every client coming through the door was this high-level, complex need. That takes its toll on you. I mean, we would have never allocated just kind of more intense cases just on the back of each other to kind of the volunteers. You know, you would try to kind of have it a bit in waves, but actually that was really difficult to do when everyone was, you know, scoring so highly in their assessments. So, yeah, really difficult.
And I think do you refer to your volunteers perhaps needing clinical supervision? I think, is that the term that you use? What do you mean by that?
So that is standard. So pre-pandemic and now all listening and counselling volunteers need to have clinical supervision, and that's on a ratio of 1 to 12. So per 12 counselling sessions, 1 session of individual supervision, or it would be less of a ratio for newer volunteers. We always say that if you need additional supervision at any time, whether the volunteer themselves been triggered by something or if there's just a bit more of a complex client situation, make more use of your supervision. My goodness, we should have had the supervisors on speed dial. The take-up of those extra sessions was quite remarkable, and so much so we actually started pulling together group supervision sessions because so many of the topics were the same kind of situation, so there was benefit in them sharing and talking that through together.
I think you say you now operate a hybrid service. What do your waiting lists look like now, whether in respect of in-person counselling or indeed online?
Yeah, so it does fluctuate, but interestingly, the wait for virtual, for online screen to screen, is higher than the in-person and the phone at the moment, which, yeah, I am surprised about. I mean, there has been a huge shift back to in-person. There is more of that happening, but actually the preference of many is for online. So what we do with clients is we will say to them, this is the wait for in-person or phone, and it lets them decide what they would prefer.
Thank you. I don't have any more particular questions to ask you, so I just wanted to give you an opportunity, if there's anything particular, whether it's in terms of things that worked well during the pandemic or any particular lessons perhaps you think need to be learned from the pandemic that you would like to share.
I guess we've covered most of that. The complexity is something I'd really hope to get over, and how that's remained since the pandemic, and we've covered that. I guess something that we haven't touched on, which we were thrust into as a result of the pandemic, is this hybrid offer. It is now an expectation that clients can choose how they want their service. However, that's actually more complex to operate, and it's more expensive because you have to have, you're paying the same leases and rates and things for having physical premises, and yet you have to have all the technology and things like that. And at a time when council funding and things has really reduced, it has caused quite a challenge for the organisation, and I'm sure Cruse Scotland are not alone in that. But yeah, it is something that we were thrust into as a result of the pandemic.
Thank you very much. My Lord, I don't have any further questions for the witness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stephen. Thank you very much indeed for your evidence. That was very helpful. I'm very grateful. Now, another slightly odd day. We're going to have a late lunch today as opposed to an early one yesterday. So we'll have a break now until 12:15.
Yes,
and then we're back for another witness. Thank you. Mr Turner.
My Lord. My Lord, this afternoon, as we now are, we have a panel addressing questions of chaplaincy and spiritual care, and we're joined by Mrs Anne Stewart and Mr Mark Evans.
Good afternoon to you both. Thank you. Now, when you're ready, Mr Turner.
Thank you, Lord. Good afternoon. First of all, before we begin, just a brief reminder that we are being transcribed this afternoon, so if we can try and speak slowly and clearly, that will prevent me getting a row, and I won't have to give you a row. Mrs Stewart, could I ask you, first of all, if you could state your full name and if you could tell His Lordship what your current role is and any different role that you might have had during the pandemic?
Okay. My full name's Anne Eleanor Stewart, and I work full-time for the Scottish Prison Service as chaplain in what's called the Reformed tradition. So I'm a Church of Scotland minister to trade, but I'm employed by the prison service. I'm mainly based at Castle Huntly Open Prison near Dundee, and I work a few hours a week at Bella, which is a women's unit in Dundee. But during the pandemic, I was mainly at Castle Huntly and 1 day a week at what was then Cornton Vale, which is no more, and now HMP Stirling.
Thank you. And Mr Evans, if you could do likewise your full name and your roles.
Mark Robinson Evans. I'm currently Head of Service for Spiritual Care and Bereavement Service within NHS Lothian, and also do 1 day a week as Professional Advisor on Spiritual Care to the Scottish Government. And during the pandemic I was Head of Department and Head of Spiritual Care for NHS Fife.
Thank you. Now, you've both provided statements to the inquiry, is that correct?
Yes.
And for your reference, my Lord, Mrs Stewart's statement is SCI WT 01291, and Mr Evans' statement is SCI WT 0512 Thank you. We're here today to talk about chaplaincy and spiritual care. We'll come on to talk about the services in a little moment. But before we do that, I think it would be of interest if we could talk very briefly about your own backgrounds and qualifications, if I may. Mr Evans, could you tell His Lordship what your background is, qualifications, and indeed how you came to find yourself in spiritual care?
So I'm a deacon, an ordained deacon with the Church of Scotland, is my background. I trained to be a deacon, and then I worked with young homeless people in the grass market for the church here in Edinburgh for a number of years, and then went on to do my nurse training at the Lothian College of Nursing. I then worked as a nurse in critical care for some years before going back to the church to work in the parish. And then about 23 years ago, I was appointed healthcare chaplain at Queen Margaret Hospital in Dunfermline. And I'd done that for 9 years, and then I was appointed head of department. I'd done that for 11 years. And then I was seconded to the Scottish Government as the national lead for spiritual care and healthcare chaplaincy in health and social care settings for 2 years. Came back to Fife for about 6 months, and then got my current post within NHS Lothian as head of service.
Thank you. And was there anything that particularly drew you, or any particular reason why you became involved with spiritual care? So,
working as a nurse, particularly in critical care, I became very aware that we use a very biomedical model of care for patients, and particularly the way I was trained 30 years ago. And I recognised that, as people, as humans, we were more than just a collection of cells or atoms or muscles or tissues which occasionally went wrong, needed fixing. We were people who loved and were loved, who were respected and were respected. And that whole aspect of holistic, person-centred care became something I was particularly interested in. So when I went back to work for the church, I also went back to university and got my nursing degree, which was in palliative care and mental health. And palliative end-of-life care, I would say, has been a real passion of mine since coming back into the healthcare system.
Thank you. And Mrs. Stewart, I noted from your statement you've been with the prison service for 17 years. Presumably you had things you were involved with before then as well. Perhaps you could tell His Lordship about your background and indeed how you came to work for the prison service.
By a circuitous route, I think would be the answer to that. So when I left school, I studied medicine for 2 years only. I can't even watch Casualty, so that was probably a bad idea. I worked for a wee while in a night shelter in Glasgow for single homeless men, and then from there to a post in what was then called the Department of Health and Social Security, both of which actually turned out to be amazing preparation for what I do now, although I didn't realise that I was going to be doing what I do now. And following a move in to train for the Church of Scotland ministry, my first paid employment for the Church of Scotland, proper paid employment, was in the healthcare, chaplaincy and palliative care. And then I moved to prison service in 2007.
And again, was there any particular reason or anything that drew you to the prison service?
I would like to say yes, but I think I moved into it before I felt I understood how perfect a job it was for me and how much I would like it and so on. It was a job, there was a job, I needed a job, applied for a job. The children had all started school. I couldn't really imagine what it would entail, but almost immediately became very bonded with it and love it and wouldn't want to work anywhere else. But it was kind of back to front.
Right. Mr. Evans, we're throwing terms around like chaplaincy and spiritual care. You obviously work in the NHS. I wonder if you could assist us by placing chaplaincy care. Just tell us a bit about chaplaincy care within the NHS, its history and the like.
So I suppose from the very dawn of time there's been a search by humanity to find meaning and purpose in life, to explain life, death, sickness, illness, the harvests, the moon change. And certainly some of the very first hospitals in the Far East were set up by Buddhist monks. If you look at our own culture, we get the word infirmary from the room within a monastic building where sick or elderly monks would get a fire and meat and warm clothes. Hospice was one of the few buildings within the monastic buildings which had a door into the secular part of the building and a door into society. And a hospice was really a shelter for pilgrims to give them rest on the journey. And even when I trained in the 80s, if you looked at the nurses' uniforms with the hats and the belts, they were all based on a nun's habit. And we get the word even now, particularly more so down in England, of curate, which comes from, cure of souls. So the idea in the medieval world that when the physician was no longer able to help you, cure you physically, the priest would come to cure your soul to make you ready for heaven. When the NHS was established in Scotland, at that time, in most situations, the health authorities only had to employ 3 people. The medical superintendent, matron and the chaplain. And the only post that's still in existence is the chaplain. And at that time, most chaplains were Church of Scotland parish ministers. And then about 20 years ago, Scotland took a very distinct change of direction with regards to chaplaincy. And up until that point, every health care chaplain within Scotland, with the exception of Roman Catholics, were employed by the Church of Scotland. And that's only because priests can't hold an employed position. So the Church of Scotland employed all chaplains and invoiced the local health boards every year for the cost. And then about 2000, there was a change, as I say. Harry Burns was the then medical director, chief medical officer. And he was passionate about holistic person-centred care. And very much from the teaching of Cicely Saunders, the founder of the modern hospice movement, who said most people will experience what we call total pain. So when they're ill, their physical is affected, their social, their psychological and their spiritual, and to give full care, we have to care for all aspects of the person. So what happened then in Scotland, NHS Scotland, was we moved from a religious model of care based on really Christianity to a healthcare model of spiritual care, which recognises that regardless of a person's beliefs or lifestyle, we're all spiritual beings. We all have deeply held values, beliefs. So that has been quite a significant change in Scotland. And I would say also world leading and highly respected in other countries. So we employ people who have specific skills to deal with or to support people's spiritual health as opposed to just their religious well-being.
Thank you. And Mrs. Stewart, could you tell us where chaplaincy sits within the prison service and how that relates to the wider prison arrangements, if I can put it that way?
So there's an Act of Parliament which says that all the prisons must have a Reformed tradition. It did say Church of Scotland, Protestant essentially chaplain and Roman Catholic chaplain. The SPS have taken it upon themselves on top of that to appoint a Muslim imam for each prison. And prisoners who belong to some other religion, part of my role is to find them assistance to practice their faith. So the religious aspect is a kind of human rights thing that prisoners are entitled to be able to practice their faith. But a big part of what we do is more what Mark's speaking about. It's the meeting the general spiritual need that people have for love and respect and being seen, being heard and all that sort of thing. We have the big advantage that although we have access to the prisoners' records on the computer, we can read all about them, we're not really expected to add very much, so we don't have to, when they talk to us, it's a safe space, so they can talk to us about what they really feel and think, rather than worrying about whether what they say might be used against them or cost them in terms of their progress or so on. So a large part of what we do is being there for prisoners to talk through whatever's on their mind, largely in confidence, obviously with some exceptions. And that's a huge thing, actually, and probably the main purpose that we have. And for theological reasons, although we work for the prison service, we are kind of out with the whole them and us culture. So, you know, within prison culture, inevitably, because one lot, the officers have a custody and order responsibility over the other lot, the prisoners, there's a separation there, and that's the way it will always be. But chaplains are kind of out with that a wee bit, which gives us a really important role in prison, and it particularly saw that during the pandemic, as I'm sure we'll get onto. But prisoners feel that we're on their side. It's not completely the case. We're not on the prisoner's side. We're not on anybody's side. But the prisoners feel that we'll listen to them. We'll give them we want to know what they're really feeling, all that kind of thing. It's a huge part of what we do. But also to enable them to practice their faith, whatever their faith is.
If I could add to that, I think all chaplains are also in a very unique situation, that we are not just there for the patients or the prisoners. We are also there to provide spiritual care of the staff, and also, more importantly, particularly during COVID, we were there to provide spiritual care to the organisation. So we are in a very unique, and certainly within the armed forces, chaplains take on the rank of the person they're speaking to, which is a really interesting concept. But we are unique, that we are one of the few services who are not just there for service users. we're there for service users, for staff, and for the organisation, and sometimes that involves speaking truth to power.
Thank you. We're going to come on to discuss the pandemic and obviously changes that impacted upon your work. Before we do that, I'd like to give His Lordship, or I'd like you to give His Lordship, a bit of an understanding in terms of what the ordinary position is, in terms of the types of services that are delivered and who's delivering them. Mrs. Stewart, you talked about the fact there's a Reformed tradition and a Catholic priest and an imam assisting delivery. Could you tell us about the kinds of services that are provided in prisons by those individuals?
There are a couple of statutory ones which actually don't particularly affect me at Castle Huntly Prison because we're dealing with men at the end of long sentences. But in all the other prisons, or most other prisons, there are people coming in either on remand or newly convicted, and there's a statutory duty for chaplains to visit, meet with a new prisoner within his first 24 hours in custody. The other statutory duty in most prisons is if a prisoner's having suicidal thoughts, there's a process under which we help them. We, the SBS, help them, and the chaplains have a role in that. So any prisoner in that category, there's a statutory duty for one of the prison chaplaincy team to visit them. Again, at Castle Huntly, we don't have the facilities to keep somebody who's in that situation, so they would be temporarily sent back to a closed condition. So I personally don't have to deal with that, but those are statutory duties. And in other prisons, the chaplains would go round the halls, and prisoners who've gone on request, as it's called, requested to see a chaplain, they would see the prisoner and the chaplain would meet for whatever purpose. It may be that the prisoners had a bereavement, for example, and want support with that. Could be anything. And then the other part is to arrange opportunities for prisoners to practice their faith or to explore faith if they're interested. At Castle Huntly, one of the privileges that prisoners at the end of their sentence who come to Castle Huntly have is they can walk about the prison unescorted, which doesn't happen in other prisons. So we have we run our chaplaincy as a drop-in, which is different from that can't happen in other prisons. So prisoners can come in for any reason, maybe not a very important reason, just to pass the time and see a kind face, hopefully.
You mentioned Castle Huntly, people are walking about. Just for anyone who's listening, what kind of prison is Castle Huntly?
So it's an open prison, Scotland's only open prison, and it's for men at the end of men aged 21 and over, at the end of long sentences, and long's defined as the upper end of what's called long-term, so an LTP, long-term prisoner, somebody who's doing up to 4 years, really, 4 years or more, no, 4 years or more. So if a prisoner's doing 4 years or more, or he's a lifer, he'd be eligible to come to Castle Huntly. We do have some short-term prisoners, but they're at the upper end of less than 4 years, so they might be doing 3.5 years, for example. So it's for prisoners at the end of long sentences, and they come to us in order to have some community access and to be tested in the community. So they might have home leaves if they have a home to go to, or even leaves to a hostel if they don't have a home to go to. They might have work placements. Those who don't have either of them, they might still get out to the community to go and meet with their social worker, just out and back on the same day, don't stay overnight. But the purpose of it really is to start testing them in the community so that the parole board can make a decision on whether they're safe to release.
In your statement, Mrs. Stewart, you told us about a sort of very broad breakdown of your work into 3 elements, I think you described them. I can remind you if you like, but are you able to tell His Lordship what those 3 elements are in terms of the type of work that you're delivering? Yeah, so I've probably already touched on them, but so at Castle Huntly we have, because we're able to run as a drop-in, we have a 3rd element, but all chaplains in all the prisons provide faith opportunities,
to practice or explore faith, or to have the milestones of faith, if you wanted to be baptised, for example, that kind of thing, preparation for that, all that sort of thing. And then there's the big part of what we all do, which is what Mark's been so eloquently talking about the hearing the person and being there for them, supporting them spiritually, emotionally, with that side of things, the big existential questions that they're having, and obviously coming to prison is a major existential happening. And then the third thing that we're able to do at Castle Huntly, and also at Bella to some degree, is just provide a place for people to come and pass the time. And that, from our point of view, is all about relationship building, because if the man initially comes in for no particular reason, just to pass the time, we then get to know him, and subsequently when he's got a real issue, then he knows us and he trusts us and he's able to come and talk to us. So.
Thank you. Mr. Evans, you've heard Mrs. Stewart talk about the formal qualifications of the chaplaincy service in the prison, in that everyone has a religious background. Is that the same in the NHS and the spiritual care teams?
So to apply so within NHS Scotland, most chaplains are a band 6. So to put that into context, that would be the same as a charge nurse, or what we would call a sister in the old days. So they must have a degree in a relevant subject, and that might be humanities, philosophy, psychology, divinity, but it has to be a relevant subject. So that's a 2 or a 3 year course. So the degree is usually a 4 to 6 year course, and then they must have a postgraduate qualification specialising in spiritual care within healthcare settings, and that can either be a postgraduate certificate, which is 2 years, or a master's, which is 3.5 yearish, and that would then allow them to register with the UK Board of Healthcare Chaplains and become a registered healthcare chaplain. And within Scotland, the movement is that NHS Scotland will only employ registered healthcare chaplains.
Do they require, you obviously have been a deacon, etc., but do they require to have any religious affiliation or the like? Do you necessarily even know what people's religious affiliations are?
So because they're healthcare professionals, and they use the same application as nurses or occupational therapists, actually there's nowhere on that application form to ask their religion. But what they must be able to demonstrate in their application and their interview is that they have a worldwide view of different faith beliefs systems, and that whole human connectedness. So basically we are asking people to prove that they can hold a space, as opposed to fix a space.
And in terms of, I'm going to ask you about, I appreciate you're at Lothian at the moment, but I'm going to ask you about Fife, if I may, standing that's where you were during the pandemic. In terms of the delivery of spiritual care services in Fife, how many people are in that team?
So I think there was myself as head of department, and we had 2.8, I think it was, whole-time equivalents.
Almost three other people.
Almost 3 people, yeah. So a very small team compared to 9,500 nurses.
And when during the day would the service be available?
So the service was available 9 to 5. That's when my staff were on the premises, and then we ran an out of hours on-call system for emergencies from 5 in the afternoon till 9 in the morning, and all weekends and all public holidays. So there was a chaplain on the end of the phone 24/7.
So if somebody wanted a service, it's available at any time. And what sort of services are provided by the spiritual care team?
So again, as Anne said, our main service was really to honour people's story, I suppose, and to listen to their story, to listen to their fears and their concerns. Not to necessarily answer those questions, but to allow them to vocalise. So if you've had a terminal diagnosis, if you've had a really bad car accident and you're scared, hospitals, particularly, critical care, intensive care, the emergency department, they can be really scary places. And sometimes you just want someone to sit with you and say, how are you doing? How are you really doing? And just allow them to explore and talk about that. And sometimes it might be as simple as just holding a hand or getting a cup of tea or just having a banter. So spiritual care would be our main, and that was all the services were referral based. So members of the multidisciplinary team, doctors and nurses would phone up and make a referral on behalf of the team or behalf of the patient or sometimes the carers. Again, like the prison service, it's just slightly different though. We have a responsibility to facilitate religious care, which would also include the right to practice, the right to explore, the right to consider. And our third element would be management, which would also include teaching. So with only 3 chaplains for a whole health board, you can't see every patient. But actually most patients just need generalised spiritual care. So a lot of our time was involved in teaching the wider healthcare team to meet those needs. And we would only see those patients who needed specific or specialised needs.
You referred there to facilitating religious care. I mean, are your team ordinarily, you've already mentioned that you don't necessarily know what their own religious backgrounds are. Are your team delivering formal religious services within the hospital?
So once they're in post, once things come up, as the manager, there would then be a discussion about what is appropriate, where's their personal integrity, what do they feel safe or appropriate doing. So one of the main reasons, so on call, the main areas we would be called to in general would be ED, emergency department, critical care, hospice or maternity. And it was usually because somebody was dying. And you would sit with the family and ask them, or with the patient, what do they want? So my personal integrity would be if it was a maternity and it was a baby at the end of life or treatment was being withdrawn from the baby, I would be, the midwives would often phone and say, the Smith family want their baby baptised. But actually when you go and speak to the family, very seldom do they want the baby baptised. They may want a naming ceremony. They may want a blessing. Occasionally they would want a baptism. And within that area, I would be happy to say to the family, if you wish, I would be happy to do that with you. Or we could get a priest, or we could get a minister, or we could get a humanist celebrant in. So it's about co-constructing with the family, what do they want? And it's not for us just to go and say, I'm the chaplain, I'm here to baptise your baby. So we would facilitate that with the family and with the family's agreement.
And you've mentioned there death. We heard from panels yesterday regarding various death rituals and rites and the like. I mean, things like last rites, is that something that you would carry out or otherwise facilitate?
So, no. So, as what we call commonly last rites is technically the sacrament of the sick. And because it's a sacrament, only an ordained Roman Catholic priest can do that. And again, often on call, you will get a phone call saying, the family want the chaplain, and you go in, and then you see the rosary at the side of the bed. You think, so you say to the family, you wouldn't be Roman Catholic by any chance? Yeah. Would you like to see a priest? And then we would facilitate and bring a priest in. In saying that, though, sometimes the families do say, no, son, can you just do, now because of my own personal theology, I'm happy to sit and do a Hail Mary and an Our Father with a family. That doesn't affect my own personal integrity or my own personal life stance. but then it's not about... So one of the questions I often say to my staff is, whose needs are being met here? Is it you as a member of staff? Is it the organisation? Or is it the patient in the bed?
Thank you.
What's the answer?
Depends which member of staff I'm talking to.
I don't suppose it's directly relevant. It's quite an interesting one, actually.
So we do have, as human beings, we bring our own baggage and our own beliefs and our own culture. And one of the key things that anyone in chaplaincy, and a hard thing they have to learn, is how do you leave that at the door? You leave it at the door, but you don't abandon it because it's core to who you are. It informs you, it shapes you, it moulds you. It gives you that point of reference for your views of the world. And yes, it's core to who you are, but you have to leave them at the door to go in and sit and say to the family, okay, what do you want? So one of the very interesting things that we have done in the past is in some branches of Islam, if it's a very early pregnancy loss, the imam may not be prepared to do a funeral service or a committal because of their belief about when life starts. So I have had Muslim families come and say to me, we want something for our baby. Now the law would technically say that because it's an early pregnancy law, it's not a baby. So if it's under 12 weeks, it's a product of conception. Above that, it's a fetus, and then it becomes a baby. Now that's what the law might say. Mm-hmm. But for that woman and that father at that time, that is their baby. Mm-hmm. So we have to respect that. And actually, how you deal with that and how you support the family has a huge impact on the grieving process afterwards. And I know we may come on to it with counsel, but because my passion has been end of life and bereavement, I do have concerns that because of the way we were able to say goodbye will or has resulted in people having complex grief as a result of the restrictions during COVID.
I'll let council take over.
Thank you, my lord. Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mrs. Stewart, coming back to the prisons, if I may, we've heard obviously regarding the kinds of religious service or provision that can be provided in the hospitals. You obviously have more formal, more obvious, if I may put it that way, religious leaders in the prison. Are there formal services that are provided in the prison? I mean, is there a Sunday service, for example?
Formal might not be the right word to describe what they're actually like, but yes, we do have. So my Roman Catholic colleague has Mass, and I have a service as well. They are quite informal, but yes, we do have services. I mean, a lot of prisoners are not very religious at all, and a lot of them, I was going to say particularly from the west of Scotland, I suppose that is actually the case. For them, religion and sectarianism have got all mixed up together, and it's all tied in with football, and there's a lot of misunderstanding, and they're not all necessarily very knowledgeable. So sometimes someone will come to me and say, like a man said to me, do I have to call you father? And I get, are you the priest hen? And they don't necessarily understand very much about which I find that all very refreshing. I relate to what a lot of you said, Mark, about a lot of the stuff that if you're in a parish as a minister or a priest or something, you're working very much within your denomination. That's not true in chaplaincy, either in healthcare or in prison, or I imagine in the forces either. Or you're dealing with people in their situation, and the example of a very sad example of a baby who's not going to make it, and helping the family to work out what it is they're looking for. They're looking for some kind of marking of this life and what is it they're looking for exactly. And so in prison as well, you kind of leave your denomination at the door to quite a degree a lot of the time, and you're just working with where's the man at and what's he really looking for. And and I think when I was training for the ministry, I didn't know then that I was going to be a prison chaplain, but I used to worry about a lot of details of theology and doctrine and things that I just don't really think about now. They don't have much impact on what I'm doing day to day and the level that we're working at with the prisoners. And some of it's also about tackling prejudices that they have. I mentioned sectarianism, so that's an issue in prison culture. So is, or can be, maybe Islamophobia a wee bit, that sort of thing. And I do spend quite a bit of time saying we don't say that anymore to prisoners, and trying to help them to broaden their horizons on a lot of these kind of issues, actually. And so that's the world that we're working in.
And in terms of again, we're going to come on, I promise, come on to the changes in a moment, but in terms of your ordinary interactions, you've mentioned obviously the elements, the three elements of your interactions. Do you tend to find, for the average prisoner, you're interacting them in the formal settings of a service, or is it more informal than that?
It's mostly very informal, even in the services. Yes, it's all relationship building, and there is no such thing as an average prisoner. The way there's not an average one of us in here, we're all completely different, and so it's relationship building, and we every in my prison, and I think it'd be true in other prisons as well. Every new cohort of prisoners that arrive at Castlehuntly, I will meet them in the first week. There's an induction process that they have to meet all the different areas of the prison, and that's where the relationship building begins. And I run through all the things that chaplaincy has to offer, and some of it's very informal, and it's just chatting in the passing outside as you walk by them. But that's all crucial to the deeper conversations. And then, of course, I mean, I've never been a man. I can't really speak about men in that level of expertise. But I think it is fair to say, and having worked in female prisons as well, I can see there is a difference. Often, I'll go no further than often, there's a male bravado thing. So when men are all together in prison, it's a tough environment, and so they have to appear tough to one another. But that's very often not their actual reality, and when they're back in their cell by themselves, all the mess of their life and their maybe addiction issues, mental health issues, family issues, all of it is pressing down on them when they're on their own. When they're in a big crowd, you would think they were all having a whale of a time because there's a lot of banter and humour. And so a big part of what I do, or any chaplain does, is when you have the prisoner on their own, you look them in the eye and you say, "How are you?" "Oh, fine, fine, fine." "You're not really fine, are you?" And they think that we have some sort of superpower that we can see into their soul. Well, we can't, we're just fishing. But they never say, "Yeah, I really am fine." They never say that because, they've got all this mess going on, and it's trying to get them to have a safe space that they can actually talk about huge issues, and many of them, and this is not to justify their crime, but many of them had terrible childhoods, and there's huge amounts of trauma from their past, and lots of things that we're able to just help them to begin to process, really.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's given His Lordship a nice background, if I can put it that, and it's interesting to hear. I'd like to talk to you now about the changes that took place during the pandemic. And first of all, Mr. Stewart, you're talking there about the interactions that you have in the ordinary time with prisoners. Did you find that changed at all in terms of quality or quantity of interactions with prisoners?
In a way, I think compared to so many others, my role didn't change a huge lot during COVID, really, because the prisoners at Castle Huntly were still opened up for most of the day. In other words, they were able to go out and walk about outside and so on. So I was still able to see them in closed conditions. That was harder for many of my colleagues, at least initially, until things loosened a wee bit. It could be quite hard, actually, for prisoners and chaplains to meet with one another. However, it still did happen in all the prisons, and actually I think chaplaincy has never been so important as during the pandemic, because, and this is absolutely no disrespect to my colleagues in other fields, but the other areas weren't there. They were working from home. The social work and the addiction staff and psychology and so on, they were still working very hard. I know they were, but it was by phone with prisoners. But we were still physically there. And even in closed conditions where it was difficult, it was still happening that prisoners were able to speak to in person, one-to-one, to a chaplain. And at Castle Huntly, certainly we were very lucky, and privileged that a lot of that still just went on. And in some ways, actually, for some of the men, I saw more of them than I would have before, because one of the things that happens at Castle Huntly Prison is prisoners go out on work placements, but they were all stopped. They weren't happening during the pandemic. Also, prisoners go out on home leaves. I think I mentioned that already. That wasn't happening during the pandemic, so they were literally there all the time. So in some ways I saw more of them probably than normal.
You mentioned comparing closed conditions, I suppose, with the open conditions of Castle Huntly. Did you have any experience of closed conditions?
Yes, I was working one day a week at Cornton Vale, which was closed prison, women's prison.
And how did that come about?
It was backfilling a post. The person whose hours I was doing had gone to work full-time at headquarters, so I was covering some hours for her, which was meant to be temporary. And it was temporary, but not as temporary as it was meant to be. So I think I was only meant to be there for 6 weeks, and I was there for 20 months, one day a week.
When did this occur? Was a particular reason that the individual had gone to headquarters?
Yes, so her role was, she's now retired, but her role was the prison service has national chaplaincy advisors, so it's a very flat structure. All chaplains are the same grade as one another, apart from a Church of Scotland or Reformed tradition person and a Roman Catholic person and a imam who work at headquarters. And it had previously been that they worked part-time at headquarters, but the SPS had wanted them in more. So she had been working one day a week at Cornton Vale, so I was asked to go there to cover her one day a week to let her go to headquarters. So that's why I was there. And that there was space for me to do that because Castle Huntly, the only reason I'm full-time there is because when I started there, we also had Northern-side Prison, so they had a wee bit of capacity to release me one day a week. And in the context of the pandemic, what was happening at the time? So at Cornton Vale, was this at the beginning of the pandemic or during the course of the pandemic? Or I wish I could remember the date that I went there. No, the pandemic was already underway. Right. Yes, it was already underway. It wasn't the very beginning, certainly, but yes, there was a lot of restrictions there. So it gave me a glimpse into what my colleagues in the other prisons were doing. I found it very difficult, I'll be honest, and I know that colleagues in other prisons who started in those jobs during the pandemic, this must be true for jobs, all jobs probably, it was difficult to get to know people and for people to get to know you, because you're going in there with a mask on, they can't even see your whole face. It was just the whole relationship building thing was very difficult then. It's very noisy in one of the halls in particular that was there at the time at Cornton Vale. A lot of women very mentally unwell or just newly coming in from the outside, still with, coming off drugs and very distressed. It was a very noisy hall. when you've all got masks on, it's very hard to hear one another. It was quite echoey, just very difficult. And I mean, my hearing's not perfect, and I probably partly lip read, but for those whose hearing is worse than mine, it was a really hard time. My then Roman Catholic colleague at Castle Huntley was quite deaf, and he struggled a lot with the mask wearing. In a job that is so much about listening to people, if you can't hear them properly and you have to get them to say it 3 times, just really hard, especially when people are emotionally in a bad place and they might be kind of mumbling through their distress. It was really hard, actually. There was another hall, it was easier because they had wee sitting rooms and things, and much easier in there. I spent more time in there because I felt I could do some good in that hall, but yeah, it was hard.
Mr Evans, Mrs Stewart's just mentioned people working from home. Were any of your team working from home?
No. We were all... we had to change the way we worked, but we all worked on site. But again, I suppose in some ways similar to Ms Stewart said, that particularly at weekends and overnight, where there was a lot of deaths or there was a lot of issues, social work, psychology, the counsellors aren't around. It's only the chaplains. And we maintained our on-call throughout the whole pandemic to ensure there was a 24/7 cover.
What changes did you make to your service provision during the pandemic?
We changed how we worked. I'm sure that the inquiry's already been told about. Most hospitals had red zones and green zones. So green zones were COVID-free and red zones were the COVID wards. My own hospital in Kirkcaldy, to give the inquiry some context, I think prior to the pandemic we had 8 intensive care beds. By the end of the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, we had 36 intensive care beds, and still 1 chaplain. So there was a huge increase in service. So what we used to do was we'd done all the green zones in the morning, then we would get changed, and then we would go into the red zones, and then we came home. That was a big change for my team because we had to start wearing scrubs, and we're normally, one of the things that marks us apart from the rest of the hospital is we don't wear uniforms. So we had to start wearing scrubs for going into the red zones, and of course full PPE. We moved a lot of our stuff onto online. So the NHS has an app, NHS Scotland has an app called Near Me, which is basically a virtual outpatient clinic, very similar to FaceTime or some of these phone apps you get for social media. So we were able to do support face-to-face online. We moved to telephone servicing for staff. We set up a staff listening service, where staff could phone and have a trained listener listen to their story. One of the biggest changes I would say we experienced was the balance of our work. So I think before the pandemic, we were on average as a team offering 20 sessions of staff support a week. So a session's between 40 and 50 minutes. 2 weeks after the first peak, so you had the peak of admissions, and then you had 2 weeks, then you'd have a huge peak in deaths, and then 2 weeks after that we would have a huge peak in staff looking for support. And I think that first peak we went from 20 sessions a week, and if I remember rightly, I think it was something like 130 sessions. I mean, it was a huge increase.
You mentioned in your early evidence that the spiritual care team provides support both for patients and staff, and you've mentioned obviously the increase in staff. Did the balance change during the pandemic in terms of who you were supporting?
There was certainly, I would say, I remember writing a report for the board, I just can't remember the number, but I think we saw something like a 200% increase in staff support. So before, I suspect maybe 75% staff, 25%, 75% patients and carers and 25% staff. And I would think during the early days we almost went the other way, and then we balanced about 50-50. We also saw staff who traditionally we would never have seen in the past. So we were seeing consultants, we were seeing senior managers, we were seeing people who historically maybe wouldn't have used our service.
You're maybe not able to say this, Mr. Evans, but are you able to give His Lordship any sort of indication as to why that might be obvious, but why that was the case?
So we know now, with hindsight, that it was moral injury, as psychologists now call it. But at the time, I suspect it was huge existential crisis, even though people wouldn't necessarily call that. So you had very experienced consultants, say, and all the clinical team, the nurses, the physios, everyone, they're all looking to the consultant for answers, direction. And the consultants are saying, we don't know. This is new. We don't know what we're doing. So it put a lot of pressure on them. I think for managers, there was that whole sense of they were almost working in the dark. And I think generally amongst the staff, one of the biggest issues was guilt. There was guilt that they felt they weren't giving the care they wanted. There was guilt that they weren't giving the treatment that they felt they should. And there was also fear. There was huge fear that people would take the virus home, would infect their loved ones, would infect other patients. And I think guilt and fear are two core existential issues where people just, and the amount of deaths, that people just were drawn to spiritual care services.
You've mentioned to His Lordship that some service provision moved online or using the apps. You've also mentioned that you're still entering red zones in hospitals, though physically present. Were you still seeing, or your team still seeing patients face to face?
Yes. So that never stopped.
And were there any changes made in terms of practice, in terms of what they were doing?
Yeah, so within the green zones, it was the plastic pinnies and the surgical masks. But as Anne said, that caused huge communication issues, particularly when you recognise that many patients admitted to hospital for COVID or during COVID were elderly. So the whole mask thing was a problem. And certainly in the red zones, and particularly, the COVID admission unit, COVID intensive care and critical care, we were in full PPE. You were like a spaceman. So you had your special fit mask, which is the one that bruises you. You had a visor. You had your full surgical disposable scrubs on, gloves, boots. So that whole aspect of sitting and listening to somebody's story when you're dressed like that just changes the concept, the whole context.
When you're seeing people face to face, particularly you've talked about end of life situations, Were there any particular difficulties that were experienced by your team?
The team themselves felt that they were letting people down because they weren't truly present. That, you know, when you hold somebody's hand when they're dying, to do that gowned up like in a spacesuit really changes the context. So they had a lot of reservations and guilt about that. And also, you know, again, so I don't think, I've alluded to it in my earlier evidence, but I don't think you realise how scary intensive care and ED and how noisy it all is and chaotic. You know, you've got people, there's buzzers and there's bells and there's machines and in the midst of this, you know you're dying and you can't even see eyes staring at you or a mouth smiling at you, or so there's a real isolation then takes place.
You mentioned there holding someone's hand. I mean, is that in the context of the pandemic, is that something you were supposed to be doing?
So later on, when we knew more about the virus, I took my gloves off to hold people's hands if they were dying. We knew it was an airborne virus. I knew I had no cuts or bruises on my hands. Now afterwards I would scrub my hands black and blue, but if that's what the person wanted, and certainly one patient, you know, was very distressed, and I asked, what can we do? And she said, I just want to touch another person. And I took my gloves off. I kept my mask on and I kept my pinny on. But I took my gloves off, and I held her hands, and we sat and sang Ali Bali Bee. And she died shortly afterwards. Was that technically in the rules dubious? Do I regret doing it? No.
You mentioned, Mr. Evans, that religious facilitation would be the ordinary course in the NHS. Were priests and other external religious leaders, were they able to come into the hospital during the pandemic?
Not at first, but we did raise later on. Jason Leach at the time issued some very helpful advice about that. But we then had the issue that many clergy are elderly and didn't want to come into the hospital, and particularly red zones. So we had to adapt and change. The Roman Catholic Church in particular were very helpful and supportive. And the Pope at the time, if I remember rightly, was Pope Francis, issued a set of words and prayers for the dying, which could be used as a substitute for sacrament of the sick, and could be said by nurses or family or chaplains where a priest was not available. And we managed to bring other resources like that together as well.
Thank you. Mrs. Stewart, we've heard there from Mr. Evans about things that people weren't able to do. Was there anything in the prison service that was prevented during the pandemic? You talked before about work placements had stopped. You also talked about the open prison being an end of sentence environment. Was there anything relating to that was changed?
Yeah, I mean, the reason we're now so overcrowded really is partly because everything just slowed down so much or was slowed down by the pandemic, and there was people. I mean, at one point, I think we had a quarter of all the prisoners in Scotland were still in remand, or so, maybe it wasn't as many as that, but a huge percentage, because the courts weren't meeting. So we had all these remand prisoners, not at Castlehuntley, but in the system, those who were already convicted but might have got themselves eligible to come to Castlehuntley were delayed in that process because courses weren't running in the closed conditions. So people that might have come to Castlehuntley weren't coming, so there was a bottleneck building up there. And then when they did eventually get to us, the purpose, as I said earlier, of being at Castlehuntley is largely is testing in the community. They weren't being tested in the community, so they didn't have evidence to show the parole board, or they had less evidence to show the parole board. So they were very worried about that. And of course they were just worried, as we all were. Everybody was worried in the pandemic. But that was their specific area of worry. In addition, was their, where are they going to get their parole? How would they get their parole if they had no evidence to show the parole board that they were trustworthy in the community? There's a course that we deliver at Castlehuntley and is delivered all over the world. Actually, it belongs to Prison Fellowship, which is a Christian voluntary organisation that began many years ago in America, but is across the world now. And they own the course, and it's about restorative justice and victim empathy, taking responsibility, all that sort of thing. And we've delivered it for years. And it's delivered, because it's owned by Prison Fellowship, it's delivered by their volunteers in partnership with chaplaincy. But during the pandemic, the volunteers weren't allowed to come in to prisons, so we had no Prison Fellowship volunteers, who are a big part of what we do, but we had none for the whole of that period. And in closed conditions, prisoners weren't really meeting in groups anyway, very much. But Castlehuntley, I was still allowed to have up to 6 in our big room in the chaplaincy, as long as they were socially distanced. And so I got permission from Prison Fellowship to deliver the Sycamore course, because it then helped the men to feel at least they were doing something positive towards their release. And I put a lot of guys through that course during that period. Just to not give a false impression of what was happening in closed conditions, though, the chaplaincy teams are very active, actually, in putting things on prisoners' TV information channels in those jails that have those. So there were things going out on the information channels, like services and so on. But we were able to actually have the men come in small numbers into the chaplaincy and gather together.
You've indicated the Sycamore course, the restorative services. Who normally delivers that?
So it's usually Prison Fellowship volunteers, but a chaplain would be present, but it's their course, it belongs to them.
And were the volunteers prevented from coming in?
Yeah, we didn't have any volunteers coming in.
You were obviously still going in. Were your Catholic colleague and the imam, were they still able to come into the hospital throughout?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no interruption of...
But that wasn't true in all chaplaincy teams. We were fortunate that we were all able to, but some chaplaincy teams, even in quite big establishments, one I can think of, he was there by himself because his fellow chaplains were all shielding, so they weren't there. So it varied from place to place, but as it happened at Castlehuntley, all 3 of us were able to come in.
And do I take it from that, therefore, there was no interruption in terms of any kind of... service provision, as it were, from the SPAs?
No, it was different, but yes, it was different, but it continued, yeah. Mm-hmm. In some ways it was more in certain prisons. So, for example, one of my colleagues in one of the Scotland's biggest prisons, not the biggest, but one of the biggest, they put the Sunday service out on the Prisoners' Information Channel because they weren't allowed to have them come to the chapel. And it had a huge audience, and prisoners were saying to the chaplains, I would never be seen going to the service, but I watch it in my cell. And so it actually was reaching people, a wider audience than it had previously. Yeah.
Mr. Evans, you told us, talking of services and the like. You told us in your statement about a particular service that took place in relation to lost pregnancies. I wonder if I could ask you maybe just to tell His Lordship a little about that.
So this came out of the baby ash scandal a few years ago, and the Morton Hall scandal. The Scottish Government produced the Burial and Cremation Act, and one of the parts of that is early pregnancy losses, so under 12 weeks should be, and it's horrible language, and I apologise to the lawyers in the room, but it's legal language. So early pregnancies under 12 weeks are products of conception. Because they're products of conception, they can't be cremated or have a funeral by law. And historically, these products of conception would have been disposed of either by being flushed down the sluice or put out in the clinical waste. And because of the findings of some of the national inquiries into the baby ashes, it was agreed that all women who had experienced a pregnancy loss, regardless of the cause, so that might have been a spontaneous pregnancy loss, it might have been a termination, and whatever, the products of conception would be sensitively disposed of through a shared cremation. Now, we had started doing that in Fife already, and that's something I had pushed because it's some of my own beliefs around how we treat human tissue and the rest. So we would have a funeral director who would come on the first Thursday of the month, the last Thursday of the month, last Wednesday of the month, and we'd leave an empty baby coffin in the mortuary, and we'd take away the full baby coffin. And then over the course of the month, every product of conception was put in an individual specimen jar, numbered, labelled, matched the woman's medical notes and placed in this coffin, so that in years to come, if somebody wishes, they can come back and say, I had a pregnancy loss in 2028, whatever, what happened to my baby? And we can now tell them. So on the Wednesday, Crosby Matthew, the funeral director, would take away the full coffin, and that would go to Fife Council, who own the crematorium in Fife. And at the end of the day, the whole box with all the contents would be cremated. And then on the Thursday, one of my staff would go and have a non-religious based act of remembrance. And one of the things we decided very early on was we would continue to do that. And regardless of what else, that one of our staff, so there was one chaplain, one crematorium staff and one funeral director. The difference was that rather than having the service inside, when we got there, we met outside in the baby garden. There was a few words said, we scattered the ashes and we all went back our separate ways again.
And why did you feel that was important?
That's a long story. So I don't know if you've ever been to a concentration camp from the Second World War. But if you have and you do a tour, the tour guides will often point out the crematorium to you. The reality is the Third Reich never built a concentration camp with any concentration camp with any crematorium. They built incinerators. And the Third Reich's belief and propaganda was only human beings were cremated, rubbish was incinerated. And that's something that has stuck with me for many years. And regardless of why an early pregnancy loss occurred, there's a sanctity of life, and that's not just about a theological or religious space, but there is a sanctity of life. And for some women, those pregnancy loss means everything. And we should treat people with the dignity and respect in death as we do in life. And for me, therefore, that was a really important thing that we continue to do throughout the pandemic.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I'm very aware that we have a number of matters which we haven't had an opportunity to touch upon this afternoon. As I indicated at the outset, the entirety of your statements and all the very interesting matters that are addressed in there will be available to His Lordship in due course. In the last few minutes, I would just like to give you an opportunity, if there's anything that we haven't managed to touch upon, or if there's anything that you particularly would like to draw to His Lordship's attention, or that you think there's any lessons which he may wish to consider. I'll come to you first, Mrs. Stewart, in a moment, but if there is anything you want to mention, I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that just now. Mrs. Stewart, is there anything that you would like to highlight?
It's been interesting just in the lead up to this, realising how, it's so long ago, and in a way that there's a lot you kind of forget, and I've been thinking about all over again, and realising, for example, just how frightening it was at the beginning. And I live next to a hospital, actually, and over the weekend a temporary morgue appeared one weekend, because they really were thinking we were in the apocalypse, and thankfully it was eventually dismantled quietly and put away again. It wasn't needed. But it was very frightening at the beginning, and I was afraid that the prisoners were very, very aware that if they caught COVID at Castlehuntly, it would be from us, the staff, because we were the ones that were coming and going from the community, and I was very aware of that. And what if I gave... There's a man I was working with as a lifer, had COPD, he'd done all this life sentence. What if I gave him COVID and killed him at the end of all these years? And so it was just such a frightening time. And it's been interesting to reflect on it all and think what chaplaincy actually did, and that we were there, and we didn't not go. We were there, and we were... in theological terms, I like to think of us as the love of God with skin on, which I appreciate with the faith may seem like nonsense, but I felt that that's what we were. We were there, being there for people who were either in hospital or in prison, and just needing somebody to be there and to hear them and to see them and to acknowledge their status, their situation. And in preparation for this as well, just talking to colleagues in other establishments and realising what a great job they did, and it was a time of creativity, actually, because we all had to, more or less all of us had to find our way through whatever our job was, find our way through, and how can we best serve our purposes with the restrictions. And some good new things came out of it that have lasted permanently, and so I'm grateful to have been part of the process, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Evans?
I suppose I would echo much of that. I think the other thing, I think one of the most privileged things you can do is be with somebody at the end of their life. So we talk in healthcare chaplaincy about holding people's pain. We can't take that pain away, particularly when it's a death or when somebody's dying. All we can do is hold it, but at the end of the day, we have to give that pain back either to the patient or the family, because it's their pain to carry. And that has a huge effect. So I think one weekend I was on call, I think we had 9 deaths in intensive care. So I'm very mindful about the impact it's had on all the chaplains, regardless of prison or hospital, because we're a very small number. We're a tiny service, but we do put. Well, I personally think we punch well above our weight, and I suspect, for me, I am very, very proud of what my colleagues in all forms of chaplaincy done for people to hold their pain, to be present during COVID. My one narc would be, I don't think that has ever been recognised. You know, in the same way that the doctors or the nurses, you know, we're almost the unforgotten services that just whittle away in the background and do what we do because that's what we do. But I think healthcare chaplains, prison chaplains, army chaplains played a significant role, and particularly those who were isolated and lonely and scared during the pandemic. And it's something that I'm particularly proud of, that as a profession we done.
Thank you. I wish we had more time, but thank you for your time, my Lord. That's all the questions that I wish to ask, unless you wish to add.
And all it remains for me to do is thank you both for attending, providing this evidence. Very grateful. A strange day, as I said. We're going to have a gap now till 3 o'clock. Don't ask me why. We'll see you again at 3 o'clock.
All right.